Respected Maulana, dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. Tonight is the first Majlis of the series of 2 Majalis to commemorate the Shahadat of our fourth Imam, Imam Ali ibn al-Hussein Zainul Abidin alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Both Majalis will be addressed by our very own Hujjatul Islam, Shaykh Rizwan Arastu, inshallah. To begin the program for the recitation of Surah Salam, I would now invite Brother Zirak Shah to please come forward. Please welcome him with a very loud salawat. Allah.
Salawat per Muhammad. جب دفن کرنے آئے تنے پاش پاش کو عابد پکارے دیکھ کے غازی کی لاش کو، ارے چچا میں آپ کی تربت بنانے آیا ہوں، ارے سکینہ اب بھی ہے پیاسی بتانے آیا ہوں، چچا میں آپ کی تربت بنانے آیا ہوں، بتاؤں کیسے چچا کیا گزر گئی ہم پر، ہر ایک شہر میں مارے گئے ہمیں پتھر، تھی مائیں پپھیاں میرے ساتھ اے علی کے پسر، یہ سارے ظلم کے قصے سنانے آیا ہوں، چچا میں آپ کی تربت بنانے آیا ہوں، حرم کو چھوڑ کے کوفے سے آ رہا ہوں چچا، بتا گئے ہیں تمہاری وصیتیں بابا، وہیں ہو قبر جہاں تھا چدا تھا جہاں پہ مشق کیزا کیا تھا شہر سے جو وعدہ نبھانے آیا ہوں، چچا میں آپ کی تربت بنانے آیا ہوں، تمہارے سامنے آتی ہے شرم کہتے ہوئے، یہ بات کرتا بھلا کیسے سامنے ان کے، ابھی ہے دور یہاں سے بنی اسد والے، ارے پپھی کی چھن گئی چادر بتانے آیا ہوں، چچا میں آپ کی تربت بنانے آیا ہوں، لین بچی کے گوہر کو ایسے چھینا تھا، گری زمین پہ سکینہ میں خون روتا تھا، وہ جس زمین پہ کانوں سے خون ٹپکا تھا، وہ خاک رکھنے تمہارے سرہانے آیا ہوں، چچا میں آپ کی تربت بنانے آیا ہوں، سکینہ اب بھی ہے پیاسی بتانے آیا ہوں۔ صلوات پر محمد۔ یا علی ادرکنی، یا علی ادرکنی، یا علی ادرکنی، ہے رو کے بازار میں دیتی تھی صدا بنت علی، یا علی ادرکنی، یا علی ادرکنی، یا علی ادرکنی، ہے نو کے نیزہ سے صدا دیتا ہے ابن زہرا، لوگ زینب کی طرف دیکھ رہے ہیں بابا، زیر خنجر نظر آتی ہے تمہاری بیٹی، یا علی ادرکنی، یا علی ادرکنی، امتحان غیرت سجاد کا کیسا ہوگا، قتل دربار میں سجاد دوبارہ ہوگا، مانگنے آیا ہے بچی کو کنیزی میں شکی، یا علی ادرکنی، یا علی ادرکنی، ہے کہہ دو ظالم سے مجھے مار لے آ کر درا، بابا زینب سے یہ منظر نہیں دیکھا جاتا، ہے مارتا ہے وہ میرے بھائی کے ہونٹوں پہ چھڑی، یا علی ادرکنی، یا علی ادرکنی، سر کھلے شام میں سادات جدھر جاتے ہیں، لوگ پتھر لیے پہلے ہی نظر آتے ہیں، آج بازار میں مر جائے نہ کوئی بی بی، یا علی ادرکنی، یا علی ادرکنی، ہے آپ کے سامنے جو بات نہیں کرتی تھی، آج بازار میں وہ بیٹی بھی خطبے دے گی، آپ کے لہجے کی اس وقت ضرورت ہے بڑی یا علی ادرکنی یا علی ادرکنی ہے ابھی دربار سے پہلے ہی گزر جائے گی سن لیا ثانی زہرا نے تو مر جائے گی لوگ کہتے ہیں حسین ابن علی کو باغی یا علی ادرکنی یا علی ادرکنی سارے بازار نے ہنس ہنس کے تماشا دیکھا اور بھی شمر نے اس بات پہ اس کو مارا جب تماچوں پہ سکینہ یہ تڑپ کر بولی یا علی ادرکنی یا علی ادرکنی صلوات محمد.
Another loud salawat. Allahumma salli. چچا میں آپ کی تربت بنانے آیا ہوں پھپھی کی چھن گئی چادر بتانے آیا ہوں. MashaAllah, beautiful recitation by very young Zirak Shah for his sehat salamti and well-being. Please recite a very loud salawat. Before I invite Shaykh Rizwan, I would request your attention for a few very important announcements. Bethlehem will continue the series of Thursday Majalis on September 9th. The Thursday program will start with Maghriban prayers, followed by Dua Kamal, and inshallah right after Dua Kamal, we will have the Majlis. These Thursday Majalis are addressed by Hujjatul Islam, Shaykh Amir Mukhtar Faizi. Ladies Majalis will continue on every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. These Majalis are held in the banquet hall downstairs and are addressed by Sister Maryam Ali Tahir. Next set of weekend Majalis will take place on Saturday, September 11th and Sunday, September 12th. The program details will be announced in next few days, inshallah. So please keep looking for the email and also the website. As you all know, Baitul Ilm under the I Am Fatima initiative was preparing care packages for our Afghan brothers and sisters. Alhamdulillah, with Allah's grace and with all of your support and help, we were able to complete the planned packages. On behalf of Baitul Ilm, I would like to thank all of you, especially our great volunteers and our donors, for their help and support. We pray to Allah that He accept our good deeds and increase our tawfiqat, so we inshallah continue following the footstep of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. At the end, I would like to acknowledge the sponsors of tonight's Majlis, which is being sponsored by the families of Tawar Mirza. They have requested for Surah Fatiha for their marhumeen. I will inshallah read their names. Ahmadi Begum, also known as Khala Jan, Zahra Begum, Muhammad Habibullah, Mirza Ali Naqi, and for the Isal Sawab of all of our marhumeen and marhuminat, please recite a Surah Fatiha with a very loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. With that, I would now request Hujjatul Islam, Shaykh Rizwan Arastu, to please come to the minbar. Please welcome him with a very loud salawat.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيبي إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد. We're here gathered together to commemorate the Shahada of our fourth Imam, Imam Abu Muhammad Ali ibn al-Hussein Zainul Abidin alayhi as-salam. I'd like to begin our majlis actually by remembering we've received news that one of our Maraj Taqleed has passed away, Sayyid Muhammad Saeed al-Hakim. He was one of the top level Maraj in Najaf. May Allah have mercy on him. We're told in a hadith that when a scholar, especially a faqih, dies, it's as though the wall of the fortress of Islam has gotten a breach. And that breach can't be filled by anyone except another faqih who can fill that gap and fill that void. So Islam itself is suffering now because of his loss, and inshallah someone else will rise to the challenge of filling the gap that he once filled. Let's recite one salawat for his forgiveness and recite a Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين صراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. The topic I'd like to spend today and tomorrow discussing is this correlation that we sometimes see, that righteousness seems to cause self-righteousness. Right? Those people who are very conscious about being righteous, about doing what's wajib on them, performing their duties, fulfilling their obligations, staying away from sin. Sometimes we find that those kinds of people also tend to be self-righteous. They tend to be arrogant. Their righteousness goes to their head. They feel sometimes when they're dealing with other people that they are not as good as them. When they even deal with Allah, sometimes it can get to the extent where they feel like they somehow have an obligation, or Allah has an obligation to them because they have now done such a good job in fulfilling all of their obligations to Him. And so righteousness sometimes leads to this feeling of self-righteousness. On the other hand, we see that sometimes people who are less devout, who aren't very good at practicing, who fail in many ways in observing their obligations to Allah, they have many good qualities. They tend to be sometimes kind and humble. They tend to be very helpful. They tend to be kind of down-to-earth people. And this paradox sometimes causes some trouble for us. Because if you see this repeatedly happening, it seems like a pattern that many people, I won't say all people, but some people, many people who are righteous are also self-righteous. And many people who are not righteous tend to be down-to-earth and humble and have some good qualities. Then what does it say about righteousness? It could lead us to question even the idea of being righteous. And sometimes if you are in a gathering where there are people who are of a certain caliber, I was thinking back to school, for instance, there's sometimes people who are academically very gifted, right? We use sometimes slang terms to refer to those people who are very smart, very good at school. They do very well. And they might have very good talents academically, but sometimes those same people are lacking socially. They're awkward socially. Sometimes they don't look very good. They don't pay much attention to their appearance. Sometimes their dress is not up to fashion and these kinds of things. And so in that school dynamic, sometimes what happens is you associate academic excellence with those other negative qualities, and it can force you to then think twice whether you want to also join their ranks. Should I also excel academically? And if I do, then look at the company I'll be in. They're people who are socially awkward, people who have these other qualities that are not very admirable. And so with righteousness also, if it's the case that people who are righteous are also sometimes self-righteous and arrogant, then it can cause me to doubt whether I should even join their ranks. Should I be like those people who are righteous? Should I be someone who is very conscious about trying to fulfill my obligations? Should I come to Jama'ah prayer whenever I can? Should I make sure I'm paying my khums on time? Should I wear hijab? Because if I do all of these things, then maybe I'll be in the ranks of those kinds of people. I'll be tempted to be arrogant. I'll be like those people who look down on the people who don't come for Jama'ah and see themselves as being superior. So it causes these kinds of problems sometimes in us when we have this dynamic and we see that correlation. Of course, correlation doesn't imply causation. It's not that righteousness causes that idea of self-righteousness in us, but there is a correlation, and the correlation sometimes is enough to dissuade us from pursuing that virtue of practicing and being devout. Sometimes what happens is that when we see this correlation, we might start to think that maybe there's not that much significance to Islam. Right? What is it really that makes a Muslim different from a non-Muslim? If I see that devout person who is a very good practicing Muslim, kind of by the book Muslim, not being a very good person, and I see people who are not practicing, maybe not even Muslim, or Muslims who are not even practicing very well, but they have very good qualities, then I might start to think that the deen itself seems to be kind of a questionable thing. What is it really adding to a person? Isn't really the main objective to become a good person? And if I could become a good person without the deen, then what's the need for all this prayer and all this fasting, and all this majlis and all these different activities that we do as Muslims? Can't I just become a good person by following in the footsteps of those people who have good qualities? And do I really need to go through all of the practices and all of the study and all of these other things that go into being a righteous person? So these are some of the issues that come about because of this correlation that we see, that righteousness sometimes leads to self-righteousness. What I like to focus on, I think there are two things to think about to help to solve this riddle and come away with a positive outlook on both righteousness as a personal virtue, and also some of these underlying beliefs and these incorrect beliefs that sometimes people have that can lead to devaluing the importance of the deen, that can even lead to a sense of pluralism, that there are multiple paths to the truth, and who am I to say that your path is wrong and my path is right, and I should just leave it all to Allah and He'll make the judgment at the end, and kind of be nonchalant and be kind of lukewarm in the interim, so I don't really make a commitment that this is true and that's false, because that's very uncomfortable. So it can lead to all these kinds of things. So one of the solutions is, first of all, to address this quality of righteousness as a virtue, see that yes, it is correlated sometimes with certain vices, and let's be aware of those and address those vices so that we don't fall prey to them. And on the other hand, to think of some of those other beliefs. So we'll spend our time tomorrow, inshallah, talking about that second part of it. One of the things to think of when well, first of all, we should realize that righteousness is undoubtedly a virtue. Right? Salah, the Arabic word being a salih person. Yusuf alayhi salam's dua, for instance, is tawaffani musliman wa alhiqni bis salihin. Oh Allah, take me at the time of my death, take me as a Muslim, one who is submitted fully to you, and join me into the ranks of the salih people, righteous people. And righteousness is obviously a virtue. It's something we should seek after. And we should do whatever we can to attain this virtue, and it's a lifelong struggle. The education that we need to engage in is a necessary hurdle. We have to constantly learn more about Allah, more about our obligations to Him, more about those virtues that we're trying to attain, more about those vices that we're trying to avoid. So the more that we can learn about those things that are going to bring us closer to Allah, the more feasible becoming salih is for us. Then actually practicing what we learn is important to become a salih person. In terms of our ethical responsibilities, in terms of our legal responsibilities, right? Doing what we're supposed to do and staying away from the things we're not supposed to do. Maybe even more important than that, having the right attitude towards those actions and towards our whole goal in life. Having in mind what that goal is and what we're trying to attain, making sure that's defined properly for us in our mind based on the guidance that we have from the Quran and the Ahlul Bayt. And so educating ourselves is one of the prerequisites for attaining that salah, becoming a salih person. That's something we should constantly be engaged in. We should live and die for that goal because we want to be, inshallah, eventually, al-hiqni bis-salihin. Allah join us into the ranks of the salihin, as Yusuf alayhi salam prayed. The pitfalls of righteousness that I mentioned in the beginning, these are correlated sometimes with righteousness. But righteousness does not cause that self-righteousness, does not cause arrogance. Right? Some people have a misconception about what righteousness is, and because of that, they become arrogant and self-righteous. They think that they have now done something very great, and so they, for instance, deserve other people's praise or deserve Allah's thanks. So one thing that we can do to make sure that we don't fall into this pitfall, that we don't become prey to this kind of temptation, is to remind ourselves that when we are attaining righteousness and becoming salih, this is something that we are actually indebted to Allah for. Right? Allah is the one who has now done a favor to us by guiding us on this path. The favor of guiding us, of educating us, of placing us in circumstances where we can attain righteousness. This is all Allah's doing. If we are able to take advantage of that, even that is Allah's inspiration that He's given us, the guidance He's given to us. What we need to constantly be focused on is our own indebtedness towards Allah. The more we are able to do and accomplish and become that's good, the more our indebtedness to Him becomes. And one of the responses that Rasulullah gave to one of his wives when she saw him spending the night in worship until his body physically was showing the signs of its swollen feet and fatigue and all these things, and said, hasn't Allah already guaranteed you paradise? Why do you tire yourself so much? And so he says that I should be a thankful servant. Right? Rasulullah is actually, if you think about it, the most indebted creature to Allah. We think of him as being he's the most perfect human being. Of course he is. But by being the most perfect human being, the most endowed with the blessings of Allah, he's also the most dependent on Allah, the most indebted to Allah for all those favors that he's received. And so he spends his time thanking Allah, showing his gratitude to Allah. So that gratitude, that indebtedness that we should feel to Allah, that's something that we should focus on. And if we constantly feel that and realize that whatever we do, it's because of Him, then we'll never have the opportunity to feel the sense of arrogance that we have now become something of our own accord or because of our own efforts, but rather it's all because of Allah's guidance of us. There's one hadith that Shaykh al-Mufid transmits to us about Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam. This man by the name of Sa'id ibn Kulthum, he goes to the sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam. And Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, in that gathering, Imam Ali alayhi salam was mentioned. And so Imam Sadiq starts to recount some memories that he has of Imam Ali alayhi salam. He says that he was the most tireless in his devotion to Allah. That he remembers how whenever two options were presented to him or came before him that were both virtuous, and in each one there was the pleasure of God, Imam Ali alayhi salam would always favor the one that would be more difficult for him to accomplish. That he would have to put more effort to please Allah rather than taking the easy way out. He remembers how his ibadah was tireless, that he would spend the nights in worship. He says one phrase, he says that nobody in the ummah was able to mimic the ibadah of Rasulullah except for Amir al-Mu'mineen. So he mentions all these virtues of Amir al-Mu'mineen, and then finally he says that the one person who is most similar to Amir al-Mu'mineen is his grandson, Ali ibn al-Hussein Zayn al-Abidin. But then he recounts from his own father, Imam Baqir alayhi salam. He says that my father said that he was once, when he was young, he was in a room where Imam Zayn al-Abidin was worshipping. It sounds like maybe he'd spent the entire night worshipping, and now Imam Baqir comes at the end of the night and sees, and he mentions that his feet were swollen from spending the night in standing. His eyes were red from crying before Allah. His nose was even somehow maybe flattened because of the extensive sajda that he had done. His forehead was scabbed over from the long sajda. So he mentions all of these different things that he saw, and Imam Baqir says that I was so affected, I couldn't control my own tears at seeing my father in this state. Right? Then he says that Imam Zayn al-Abidin asked him, his son, to go and bring that sahifa, that book in which the virtues of Amir al-Mu'mineen are mentioned and the ibadah of Amir al-Mu'mineen is described. So Imam Baqir goes and fetches the pages of the book and gives it to Imam Zayn al-Abidin. He looks at the book, he flips through it a little bit, and then he shakes his head and puts it down and says, "Man yaqwa ala ibadati Amir al-Mu'mineen." Like, who can do the kind of ibadah that Amir al-Mu'mineen used to do? So this is Imam Zayn al-Abidin, whose title itself is that, the adornment of the worshippers, someone who's famous for his long sajdas, who's famous for spending the night praying 1,000 rak'ah on a nightly basis. He feels ashamed when he looks at the ibadah of his grandfather, Amir al-Mu'mineen, and says, well, how can I ever hope to achieve the kind of ibadah that he achieved? And then we pray 3 rak'ah Maghrib. That basically is our ticket to get out of hellfire. Right? Sometimes the most that we can hope to accomplish by performing our wajibat is that at least we can't be punished by Allah for having sinned, for having failed to pray. But is that a source of getting closer to Allah, to becoming a righteous person? Is it really a good deed? Sometimes our wajibat tend to be closer to sins than they are to good deeds. If we perform them poorly, with inattentiveness, if we, God forbid, if we even mix into it riya and sum'ah and ujub and these kinds of things that degrade that act, which was potentially an act of goodness, into actually a sin. So if we think about that indebtedness, right, look at the models of the Ahlul Bayt and see how they dealt with their own actions and what attitude they had towards their own righteousness, then we'll see that righteousness actually doesn't lead to arrogance, but it leads to a great sense of indebtedness and humility. One of the challenges Muslims sometimes have when they look at the Quran, they look at the stories of the prophets, and they see phrases like Adam and Hawa, alayhi salam, for instance, saying, رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. Adam and Hawa, Adam at least is infallible, Hawa is a righteous woman. We don't know whether she's infallible or not, but at least a righteous woman. And they are saying that, oh Allah, we've wronged ourselves, and if you don't forgive us and have mercy on us, then we're going to be losers. And we look at that, we look at phrases like Musa alayhi salam saying, إِنَّهُ مِنْ عَمَلِ الشَّيْطَانِ. He kills this Egyptian person, and then this is the actions of shaitan that have taken place here. And we look at all these declarations of dhulm and of sin that the prophets themselves attribute to themselves, or sometimes Allah attributes to them, and we become confused. Why is it, or how is it that an infallible can perpetrate a sin? Dhulm, dhanb, ghiwaya, all these are words that have to do with misguidance and sin and ma'siyah, disobedience. And all these words are used in the Quran to describe some of the actions of infallible prophets who never commit a mistake, who never commit a sin. Or we look at ahadith, we look at du'as, think of some of the phrases, dua kumail that we always recite, ظَلَمْتُ نَفْسِي وَتَجَرَّأْتُ بِجَهْلِي. Imam Ali alayhi salam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, transmitting from Khidr alayhi salam, is saying, I've wronged myself. In my ignorance, I have had the gall to act like this in front of you, Allah. Tajarra'tu bijahli. So we wonder, how is it possible for those kinds of people to use this kind of a word to describe themselves. And sometimes we have feebled explanations. We'll say, oh, they're not speaking for themselves. They're just putting words in our mouth. So we, the sinners, can use their words to pray to Allah or to talk to Allah. Or we interpret their words and say, oh, it's not really a sin, and we worry about that. But the important thing to do when we read the Quran or read ahadith and du'as is not to quickly come up with justifications and rationalizations to fit those texts into our own preconceived notions. The important thing is to think, why did Allah say it like this? He could have chosen not to mention those things, not to use those particular words like dhanb and ma'siyah and ghiwaya and dhulm, which are words of sin and injustice, and like they're bad words. The worst things you can do are these kinds of things. He chose to use these words for the prophets, while at the same time affirming what our intellect already tells us, that the prophets have to be infallible. They would never commit an injustice against Allah. They would never commit a sin. They would never do what's wrong. So why is this vocabulary being used? That's the question we should ask. So what we understand if we reflect on those verses, on those du'as, is that the imams, the prophets, these infallibles, they themselves, in their own eyes, when they do their ibadah, when they do these righteous deeds, they always feel that they're inadequate, that they haven't done nearly enough to fulfill their obligation to Allah. For you and me, if we were to do something like what they did, we would feel very proud. And immediately we'd end up with that same correlation of becoming arrogant and feeling like, wow, I did such a great prayer. I spent the entire night in 1,000 rak'ah prayer. If I could even bear that, I would feel so proud at the end of that. But someone like Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam, he does the same thing and feels like, where's my ibadah? Where's my grandfather's ibadah? In his eyes, he's just wasted his time. Not wasted his time doing something that was useless. No, wasted his time because he didn't do enough to fulfill the obligation of that prayer and to fulfill a sense of gratitude towards Allah. To think about it, sometimes I think about, maybe you have different families, or you have, you have different families, for instance. So you have a family that's very academically accomplished. The parents are, highly educated, and they go to school alongside a child who's from a family of people who are uneducated. The parents, for instance, are recent immigrants who didn't have the opportunity for education. They're working class, and now this child is maybe the first person to go to school, the first person to have some education. The expectation that the teacher will have for that child, the second child, is naturally going to be much lower. If the child from the first family gets a particular grade or has an accomplishment that he's able to do, it won't nearly be as special because he's from a family where he's had education and he's had the inculcation of these values and all these things all his life. For him to accomplish that same grade that this other person who's never had education in his history, who didn't have a good upbringing in terms of education, now that person accomplishes the same thing, they get the same grade. That same grade is not really the same for those two people. The one who worked hard and against all odds got that grade, he's accomplished something. The one who should have actually excelled and done so much better and only got that grade, he actually fell short of the mark. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Why didn't he accomplish a lot more than he did? So the same action can be virtuous for one and below the mark, even lacking virtue for another. You translate the same thing to our families. Right? This is a good message for children, especially if you're a child who's in a family where Islam is being practiced. Your parents are teaching you. Your parents are practicing. You're being raised with prayer, and you're being brought to a Sunday school or being educated in Islam. And this is the kind of family that you're raised in. Don't be satisfied with yourself being the same as a peer who may not have all of those things. We have other youth in the community whose parents are not like that, who aren't raising them with an Islamic mindset, with Islamic knowledge, with Islamic practice. Those two children, they shouldn't expect the same from themselves. If they both do the same or are the same in terms of their Islamic development, there's something wrong with that child who's from an outstanding family, from an Islamic perspective. Why is he only there? Why is she only at that level? She should expect so much more of herself. So these kinds of ways of thinking about things, if you think about the indebtedness that we have, if we think about what our potential was and then what we did with that potential, right? That's the real question that we should ask ourselves. So don't evaluate yourself just on the surface, what you did, but really what could you have done, and then what did you do with the potential that was there in you. And then whatever you are able to do, this is the grace of Allah. It's indebtedness that you have towards Allah. You are now more impoverished to Allah than you were to begin with. And that phrase that Imam Zayn al-Abidin again has in Sayyid Sajjadiyah, where he says that whenever I thank you, Allah, the thanks itself obligates me to thank you again, because you're the one who inspired me to give that thanks. It's not that you have a certain number of thanks that you have to finish before you can fulfill your obligation to Allah. You can never fulfill your obligation to Allah. The goal is not to fulfill the obligation, it's to show Him that you recognize your inability to show Him proper thanks. And the Hadith Qudsi of Prophet Musa alayhi salam, Allah tells Musa, thank me the way I'm supposed to be thanked, and praise me as I deserve to be praised. Musa thinks about it for a minute and then says, I can't. It's impossible for me to thank you and praise you the way you deserve to be thanked and praised. Allah says, that's exactly what I wanted you to realize. Now you've done it. Not by actually thanking me, but by recognizing your indebtedness and recognizing your inability to do so. That's really our goal. I think of a great blessing that your parents have given you. All the sacrifice, all the expense that they've borne, all the things that they've done for you. Right? At the end of the day, no matter what you do back to them, you're never going to repay them for those favors. It's not expected of you. You can't. Saying thank you is simply an acknowledgement of your indebtedness to them. Acknowledging what they have done. It's not a repayment for anything that they've done. And if that's our relationship with our parents, then of course with Allah, it's infinitely greater. We're never going to actually repay Him. All He wants from us is a recognition of our indebtedness and a recognition of our inability to ever fulfill our obligation to Him. That is sufficient praise. So if this is our attitude then towards our righteousness, right? We started with the question, does righteousness lead to self-righteousness? Well, if my righteousness is accompanied by this kind of attitude, where yes, I was able to learn something good, this is by the grace of Allah. It's because of the efforts of the Ahlul Bayt in teaching, it's the efforts of scholars who were raised by the Ahlul Bayt and nurtured by them, that they've passed on this knowledge to me. Because of the efforts of this teacher that was compassionate enough and wise enough to teach me this thing. Right? So it's all indebtedness. If that's my attitude towards the one piece of knowledge that I've learned, I'm not going to come away from that educational experience thinking, mashallah, I'm so knowledgeable. Now I really know a lot, all through my own effort. That was Qarun's mistake. Right? All of his accomplishments, his folly was in attributing it to himself and saying, this is all because of my knowledge. I was smart enough to gain all this wealth. As soon as he points to himself and thinks he's the source of whatever he's accomplished, that's the start of his downfall. There's a hadith that says that when a person is studying and learning, they keep on learning and learning and learning until the point where they say, I know, then they become jahil again. Right? As long as you're learning and you recognize that you have there's an infinite journey ahead of you, then you're on the right track. And one of our scholars in Qum, I remember he was recounting Allama Tabatabai at a memorial for him. And he said that one of the things that he used to say a lot, this is Allama Tabatabai, a real Allama. Sometimes we use the term Allama for people who are not worthy of the term. But a real Allama, right, who's steeped in knowledge. And he used to say that you should always keep in mind what you don't know, not what you do know. Because what you don't know is always infinite. وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ in Surah Yusuf, right? Above everyone who has knowledge, there's always one with more knowledge. And keep in mind what you don't know, and keep a good handle on that. You'll always keep yourself in your place. No matter how much you know, you'll always realize how ignorant you are because you have an eye to what you don't know yet. What you do know is always finite. But if you keep on looking at what you do know and put a lot of stock in that, then the tendency, the temptation to feel arrogant and to feel like, mashallah, I don't know a lot is always there. So these are some ways then that we can try to mitigate this problem. Be righteous, pursue righteousness with all of our heart, with all of our effort, but realize that every step towards righteousness that we are able to take, we're only indebted more to Allah. It's by His favor and His grace and His mercy that I was able to accomplish that. It's not my own effort. It's not something that I should be proud and arrogant about. It's something that should humble me more before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Recite wa salawat ala Muhammad wa alihi. Recite one more salawat ala Muhammad wa alihi. Another thing to think about to keep ourselves in our place and mitigate that temptation to become arrogant is to think about what really leads to salvation. But sometimes we are mistaken by thinking that if I do a large quantity of acts, for instance, that's going to be my ticket to salvation, that I can earn my salvation. So if I pray enough, if I fast enough, if I do ziyarah enough, if I come to enough majalis, if I shed a tear for Imam Hussein, that these are all tickets to salvation. Now it's true, all of these things are extremely important and they are necessary parts of our pathway to salvation. But the idea that we can earn our salvation through our own acts is a mistake. If you've ever had a conversation with evangelical Christians, they have part of the equation right. They come up with a wrong conclusion and think that therefore Jesus Christ is your savior. But where they start is actually accurate. And it's something that we have reflected in our ahadith as well. So what they say is that you don't attain salvation through acts and faith, but faith alone is sufficient. Right? What they're starting at is that we can't earn, like I just mentioned, we can't actually ever fulfill our obligation to Allah. We can never thank Him enough. We can never do enough. Every sin that we commit, every time we disobey Him, we deserve punishment. He doesn't owe us forgiveness. If I say sorry, if I say astaghfirullah, He doesn't owe me forgiveness. If He forgives me, it's out of His grace and His mercy. Even if I do an act of righteousness, He doesn't owe me anything for this prayer I just prayed or for this charity I just gave. He doesn't owe me anything because of that. Whatever He gives me of reward in the dunya or the akhirah is a grace from Him. It's His grace that we need to seek after. His fadl. The word for grace is fadl. His mercy, His rahmah, His karam, for instance, His generosity. These are the things that we have to seek after. And show Him that we are open receptacles, ready receptacles to receive all of this from Him. Not that if I just pray enough that I'm going to earn paradise. I'm going to work and I'm going to get to a point where I deserve paradise. That itself is a mistake. Thinking that I can ever deserve paradise because I've done enough good acts. In this dua, we have a dua of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam that isn't in Sahih Sajjadiyah. Recite wa salawat ala. It's the dua that he narrated to Abu Hamza. We know it as dua Abi Hamza al-Thumali. It's a long dua, beautiful dua, in the same ilk as the du'as of Sahih Sajjadiyah. In that he says one phrase, he says, لَسْتُ أَتَّكِلُ فِي النَّجَاةِ مِنْ عِقَابِكَ عَلَىٰ أَعْمَالِنَا بَلْ بِفَضْلِكَ عَلَيْنَا فَإِنَّكَ or لِأَنَّكَ أَهْلُ التَّقْوَى وَأَهْلُ الْمَغْفِرَةِ. He says that I don't do ittikal. Ittikal is to rely on something. I don't rely for my salvation from your punishment on my own acts. What I rely on is your fadl, your grace. Right? So it's not that I can, if I pray enough, if I fast enough, then I earn paradise, I deserve paradise. Now again, the message is not to come away saying, well, what's the point then? That's where those evangelical Christians make a mistake in coming up with the wrong solution. They say because we can't do enough to earn paradise, there's no hope in our actions. I've committed sins, somebody has to pay for the sins. And so that's where they bring in Jesus Christ and say, because God himself has manifested himself like this, he sacrificed himself, and he pays for our sins. And once he pays for our sins, and I accept that this is the transaction, then I'm free. I'm off the hook for all of my actions because I believe that this is the system that he's created for us. Now that's a false system. It's a false solution, a wrong solution for the problem. The problem is true. That yes, I can't earn paradise. The way I get to paradise, the way I get to salvation is only because of Allah's grace and mercy. But now I have to prove to him that I'm worthy of that mercy and grace. How do I prove that? How do I prove that I'm worthy? By doing everything he's told me to do. By staying away from everything he's told me to stay away from. And by having this attitude of constant indebtedness and poverty before Allah, so I show him that I'm a worthy recipient of his grace and his forgiveness and his mercy. That's where we can get salvation. And that formula is amazing. It's an amazingly therapeutic attitude to have. It's correct for one thing, but if you think about what I just said, that puts us in our place constantly. No matter how well I pray, I never deserve, because of that prayer, Allah's reward. It's not a transaction. I'll pray this prayer, I deserve, one tree in paradise. I'll say the salawat, I deserve one, palace in paradise. Just that attitude sounds so callous. Like, what kind of attitude is that of a slave to a master? I'll do this for you, you better do this for me. I'll pay you this, you owe me that. And that's not the attitude of a servant. That's not the attitude of a slave. It almost sounds like an equal, if not a superior, telling someone else what to do. So if we realize that this is our state, then all the righteousness that we can attain never leads us to feel arrogant before Allah. Just the opposite. It makes us feel indebted. It makes us feel like the only way that this righteousness that I've tried to nurture is going to have any effect in the hereafter, and I'll see salvation, I'll see paradise, is if Allah has mercy on me. If he forgives me. And if he shows me his grace. That doesn't mean, again, that we give up on these acts of devotion and prayer and good deeds and avoiding sin. All of those are extremely important because, again, we have to prove to him that we've done with the best we can, which is, I know it's nothing. I know it's meager. I know it's not worth you at all. But this is the best I can do. Maybe it's not even the best I can do, but it's what I've done, and I'm trying to do better. Like, that's the attitude we should have. Saying I've done the best I can do, that's also a little bit too much. Because that's usually not the case. At least speaking for myself, that's usually not the case. But at least we can say, I've made an effort, I'm going to try to do better, but I know that no matter how much better I do, it's never good enough. Now that would, if you stop right there, that would lead to intense hopelessness. Like, what's the point then? The key is the raja, the hope that comes from Allah's grace. Right? So in the same dua, this dua of Abi Hamza Thumali, right, we say the same thing. When I look at إِذَا نَظَرْتُ إِلَى I've forgotten the phrase now, but he says, when I look at my own actions, when I look at myself, فَزِعْتُ. Right? I feel an intense sense of terror. I'm so scared when I look at what I've done and who I am. But when I look at وَإِذَا نَظَرْتُ إِلَى كَرَمِكَ طَمِعْتُ. When I see your grace and I look at your grace and your mercy and those qualities in you, Allah, that's when I have such lofty hopes and desires. Right? That's where that fear and hope come in. Fear because of who I am and what I've done. Fear because I'm afraid that I've earned God's wrath and punishment. But hope because Allah is extremely merciful, extremely generous, extremely forgiving. He doesn't want me necessarily to become a ma'soom, but He wants me to make every effort I can and keep on this path towards Him, and then He'll make up the difference. Through His outright forgiveness and grace, through shafa'ah. Right? That's what shafa'ah is for. To make up that difference. We get as close as we can to the Ahlul Bayt. Through learning about them, through commemorating these events, through learning their teachings, trying to emulate those teachings. We do what we can. The gap is always infinite between you and me and the ma'soom. We don't have this aspiration that I'm going to become like Amirul Mu'mineen, I'm going to become like Imam Zayn al-Abidin. That's not really, that's the aspiration. That's never going to happen. But that direction is there. The path is there. The goal is there. That's clear. I know where I stand, and I know where they are. And as long as I'm doing my best to move in that direction, even if the path yet to go is infinite, I've shown that I'm on the path. And then their shafa'ah can make up the rest. They've been given that grace by Allah. It's a manifestation of Allah's grace that they are shafi' for us, inshaAllah. And so they can make up that difference. It's one of the mechanisms through which Allah dispenses His grace. Right? He can do it directly, but He chooses to do it through them so that it creates not only a connection between us and Allah, but us and the Ahlul Bayt. So if we keep in mind these dynamics and have the right attitude towards righteousness, then we can at the same time pursue righteousness. That can be our ultimate goal, become salih inshaAllah, and constantly become more and more salih. But at the same time, we don't fall prey to these different challenges, these different vices that lie in the path of those who pursue salah. Recite salawat. These are some things we could work on to address this problem on an individual basis, looking at our attitudes, our akhlaqi issues, and by addressing them and thinking about them in a different way, we can become righteous and at the same time be safe from the pitfalls of righteousness, which is self-righteousness and arrogance. There are some other issues I want to inshallah talk about tomorrow that are also extremely important, because this, like as I mentioned in the beginning, this paradox of seeing righteous people oftentimes being self-righteous leads to all of those other problems as well. We start to think about pluralism, that maybe pluralism is the solution, right? Instead of being a righteous person and then becoming self-righteous, thinking I as a believer am always better and everyone else is inferior to me, maybe I should become pluralistic and think, this is good for me, maybe that's good for you. Who am I to say that what you do is wrong and what I do is right? Right? Because it's very uncomfortable. If I say this is right and that's wrong, then it leads to challenges in our interactions with people. How are we supposed to interact with a person who is following a false religion, who's committing sins? When we know that those things are evil, those things are wrong, how can I deal with that person on a daily basis? And so we come up with ways to compromise on principles. We don't need to do that though. So inshallah, we'll talk some more about this tomorrow and see if we can address those problems as well, and stick with the principle that righteousness is the virtue that we want to attain, and we don't need to succumb to these pitfalls of self-righteousness and arrogance. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa ala. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Sallallahu alayka ya Rasulallah. صلى الله عليك وعلى أهل بيتك الطيبين الطاهرين. صلى الله عليك يا أبا محمد علي بن الحسين زين العابدين. السلام عليك يا سيد الساجدين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of Karbala showed us a great mercy by striking Imam Sajjad down with an affliction of sickness that prevented him from being able to fight, that prevented him from even being able to stand, and because of which he even faded in and out of consciousness. By doing that, he saved the line of Imamah through Imam Zayn al-Abidin, so the line of guidance could continue until the line of the Mahdi. It was a mercy for Imam Zayn al-Abidin himself as well, because while he was in the state of consciousness and unconsciousness, he was also mercifully oblivious to the actions and the events that were taking place on the battlefield of Karbala. He didn't witness when his brother Ali al-Akbar went out to the battlefield. He didn't see how قَطَعُوهُ إِرْبًا إِرْبًا, as he was cut into pieces. He didn't witness when his cousin Qasim went out without a proper set of armor to protect him. He didn't see his cousins Aun and Muhammad. He didn't witness Ali Asghar, his younger brother, when the arrow was shot and he was slaughtered. He didn't see Imam Hussein alayhi salam slaughtered, beheaded. He didn't see the aftermath of Karbala either, when the 10 horsemen were called to trample the body of Imam Hussein, first on his front and then on his back to crush his bones. But after all of that, when the army of the Kufans entered into the camp of Imam Hussein to loot and pillage, as though they had just gained some victory over Kuffar, when the ones that they had gained this victory over were the family of the Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet. When they came into the tents, he was able to witness this. He came into consciousness. They extended their looting and pillaging to the clothing of the women. They burned down the tent. And they would have killed him as well, but for the fact that they saw that the sickness had afflicted him so much that they said, we don't want to have the blood of any more of the Ahlul Bayt on our hands, and he'll succumb to this sickness that he has. And so he was able to be saved by the divine grace of the sickness that Allah had afflicted him with. But the task on Imam Zayn al-Abidin after Karbala was extremely difficult. He was called on to be a true heir of Nuh alayhi salam. He was the Nuh of the family of Muhammad. As Nuh alayhi salam was called on to rebuild humanity with those 8 or 80 people who boarded his ark with him, Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam was also called on to rebuild humanity, to rebuild a civilization. But the 80 people, the 72 people that Nuh had on his ark, Imam Zayn al-Abidin did not have. The best people, the best Ahlul Bayt, the best companions, had all been martyred on the battlefield of Karbala. And it fell upon Imam Zayn al-Abidin to rebuild the civilization, not from the receding floodwaters, but on the blood of the martyrs of Karbala. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون.
Hussein, 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 Hussein.
Zayn al-Abidin, oh my Imam Zayn al-Abidin, oh Sajjad, you taught us the art of supplication, you showed us the power of prostration, to make Islam our life's foundation, and how to ask Allah for salvation. Such is your status, O holy soul. You made Allah's love your only goal. Oh my Imam Zayn al-Abidin, oh my Imam Zayn inside your veins flows the purest of blood. You came down from heaven like a rosebud and left your scent forever in this world. Your name will live on forever now. Till death you'll be in our hearts we vow. Oh my Imam, oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh Sajjad. You were in prison, your feet were in chains, and on the chains splattered were your bloodstains. Inside your heart were the scars of those pains, of what you saw that day on the hot plains. Oh, you are patience personified. You thanked Allah though your hands were tied. Oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh Sajjad. You saw your father's head on that spear, your mother's bareheaded and in fear. Your sister was treated so severe that blood was pouring down from her ear. And yet you were so brave that you spoke, and in that courtyard the world awoke. Oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh Sajjad. For 40 long years you kept on weeping, 'cause in your mind Sham kept on repeating the lashes you got and all the beating. For all these feelings there is no healing. Those memories always will be raw, of what you heard, felt, and what you saw. Oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh Sajjad. You are my guidance, my inspiration. To emulate you is my intention. In every moment, in every second, your love will flow in me like an ocean. You are the leader of all of man, so please give us all a helping hand. Oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh Sajjad. Believing brothers are praying for this. Throughout the world one day there will be bliss, when our Imam comes and rules with justice. With love and peace we will all coexist. We raise our hands, we cry and we say, we pray for this moment every day. Oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin, oh my Imam Zain al-Abidin. Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein,
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. सज्जाद मैं ज़ैनब हूँ, मेरे सर पे रिदा कोई नहीं, बाजार जफा। सज्जाद मैं ज़ैनब हूँ, मेरे सर पे रिदा कोई नहीं, बाजार जफा। सज्जाद मैं ज़ैनब हूँ, मेरे सर पे रिदा कोई नहीं, बाजार जफा। मजमा है कूफियों का, मेरे चलने की जा कोई नहीं, बाजार जफा। सज्जाद मैं ज़ैनब हूँ, मेरे सर पे रिदा कोई नहीं, बाजार जफा। सज्जाद मैं ज़ैनब हूँ, बाजार। सज्जाद मेरे सर से आदाने छनी चादर, बलवे में नबी ज़ादी, फिर رسوائی گئی در در، مل جائے رضا مجھ کو اور میری دعا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد چلوں کیسے، لاکھوں ہے تماشائی، یاد آتا ہے رہ رہ کے عباس میرا بھائی، فریاد کروں کس سے، اب تیرے سوا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا مجبور ہوں، بے بس ہوں، میں رو بھی نہیں سکتی، دروں کی اذیت سے میں سو بھی نہیں سکتی، اس درجہ مصیبت میں میرا ہمدرد کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں اب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد تیری حالت دیکھی نہیں جاتی ہے، بے پردہ مجھے دیکھے یہ بات رلاتی ہے، سجاد تیری طرح کانٹوں پہ چلا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جاتا ہے سوئے زندہ اب کنبہ محمد کا، رسی میں بندھے قیدی کانٹوں سے بھرا رستہ، امت نے ستم ڈھائے قسمت سے گلا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار ستم میں تھا زینب کا جب عالم، مظہر میں لکھوں کیسے ظالم نے کہا جس دم، ہے کون تیرا وارث، زینب نے کہا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا سجاد میں زینب ہوں، میرے سر پہ رضا کوئی نہیں، بازار جفا یا حسین یا حسین۔
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم أنت السلام ومنك السلام ولك السلام وإليك يعود السلام. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليك يا رسول الله. السلام على الأئمة الهادين المهديين. السلام على جميع أنبياء الله ورسله وملائكته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام على علي أمير المؤمنين. السلام على فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام على الحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة أجمعين. السلام على علي بن الحسين زين العابدين. السلام على محمد بن علي باقر علم النبيين. السلام على جعفر بن محمد الصادق. السلام على موسى بن جعفر الكاظم. السلام على علي بن موسى الرضا. السلام على محمد بن علي الجواد. السلام على علي بن محمد الهادي. السلام على الحسن بن علي الزكي العسكري. السلام على الحجة بن الحسن القائم المهدي. عجل الله تعالى فرجه وسهل الله مخرجه وظهوره وجعلنا من أعوانه وأنصاره والمستشهدين بين يديه. السلام عليكم جميعا أهل بيت النبوة ورحمة الله وبركاته.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل